Hi there, I'm Moni Barrette. I am Director of Collection Development and Publisher Relations for LibraryPass, and of course, the in-house librarian for Comics Plus. I did pool our resources, and by far in-house, our best resource is Mr. Rob Randle, who is actually our production director. He is a creator in his own right, and he's a huge manga aficionado, and he's so knowledgeable. So, hi, Rob, how are you today?
Hi, Moni. Thanks.
Thank you for coming on and talking to us a little bit.
Of course. My
Awesome.
pleasure.
So, you ready
Great.
for some questions?
Definitely. Please shoot.
Nice. So, biggest thing right off the bat, what should librarians and teachers and even parents, what should adults and caretakers know about manga overall? And can you do anything to kind of explain why it's so appealing to students?
Sure. Well, all right. I guess let's address the second part of that first. Let's talk about its appeal, and then we can talk about what it is as a caretaker or as an educator to know from there, right? So first of all, let's talk about like what manga is. Manga is basically the Japanese word that means comics, literally like whimsical pictures, and it can trace its origins, you could all the way back to like the Edo period. But for our sake, we credit the godfather of manga, Osamu Tezuka, as sort of the one who first sort of broke ground with the style that has continued to sort of inform manga, which we should basically define is not a genre, it's a style. It's a style of visual storytelling, and specifically deals with very exaggerated emotional facial depictions, as well as it has its own sort of visual language that is unique to Japan. And so that's really what we talk about when we're talking about manga, as sort of being someone immersed in those traditions. And then that has, of course, over the decades since, influenced other art forms around the world, and it has been in turn been influenced by them. So manga has always been an evolving art form for certain. But what makes it so popular is one, I think that it's probably worth noting that first, the career of a mangaka, that is, a manga creator, manga master, you might even say, is a very competitive lifestyle. They are constantly trying to produce the next great thing, the next great book, and they are constantly trying to gain and keep their readership, as you can imagine. And so, like, it stands to reason that they have developed a very intimate knowledge of what their fans want. You can see where the modern mangaka are very influenced by a lot of Western stuff, but that actually goes all the way back to Tezuka, who was very influenced by Walt Disney and the Mickey Mouse and that look. Where you look at his early stuff, you can see a lot of that influence, as well as even going back even farther to the sort of the ukiyo-e period of Edo Japan, which is sort of what sort of defined some of the style that grew into the manga art, is also influenced by sort of the Portuguese traders who were starting to influence with Western art that was then coming. So it's been this like love affair of East and West, and you can see people like Van Gogh and whoever. We're getting off topic, but like I think a lot of people are very engaged by the exciting visuals, the frenetic storytelling, and especially for those who are more of a visual mindset, can appreciate the very overt caricature of emotional expression that manga uses. These oversized eyes and these wide, mouths that will can infer a lot of the story. Some readers will actually understand it in reverse. It's a very dynamic medium. Comics are in general, but manga in particular has a very artistic style, a very unique style that I'm sure you're familiar with. I hope that explains a little bit about why it's so popular. And again, circling back to the idea of like knowing their audience, it's worth exploring that a lot of manga is written or created with a particular audience in mind. In a way, you might even argue that it's a gendered approach in mind, whether it's boy comics or girl comics, and we can get into that.
Okay, yeah, and I did notice too, just from my first time reading manga perspective, was they also seem to handle deeper topics with sort of a more whimsical, because of the artistic style you're talking about and that kind of thing. So it was kind of interesting to kind of look at something that was so deep. And in this case, it was, sexuality and gender issues, but then like big eyes and the kind of artistic style and kind of making it a little bit more silly. So not silly, but
certainly,
just not as,
certainly it can seem that way. I mean, it is playing into its own style, and it has, certain rules that are followed, so to speak, about how, how certain emotions are depicted, for instance, with, floating sweat or, lines coming out of their heads, things like that. And you will see subtle or less than subtle differences depending on the books, whether, these quote unquote boy comics, girl comics, they follow their own tropes too. And again, as they've evolved, they've crossed over quite a bit too. And that actually explains some of the more popular books.
So let's get into that. Let's get into the types of manga. And if you want to attach this with this question, is your recommendation,
of course,
for these categories?
Sure thing. There are some like kind of broad stroke approaches that we could take for certainly our listeners and viewers that kind of get your feet wet as far as the manga creators are concerned. So start at the beginning, and before comics get gendered, there's comics that are appropriate for both boys and girls, particularly young boys and girls. So that would be Kodo Momuke, which would be for ideally any kid from like 3 to 10 years old would appeal to this sort of but which again isn't necessarily for either all boys or all girls, although maybe they might skew one way or another. So and then let me just answer your second question as I do this. My recommendation for that is really, really charming book called Cheese Sweet Home. Cheese Sweet Home would appeal to both boys and girls, but also I think for both adults and kids. This is one of those that just like hits on all levels. It's this like kind of heartwarming, heart-wrenching story about this little kitten who's got separated from its mother and is adopted by this Japanese family, and then all of its antics that it gets into from there, being a cat. And it's told for the most part from the animal's perspective, and it has, like we were saying, a lot of non-verbal storytelling. So like little kids don't even necessarily need to read it to kind of get what's going on, but of course there's layers to it that go from there. And so like that kind of hits on both of those sort of your first question too, like what appeals to kids versus what appeals to the teacher or the educator or the librarian. This one kind of, again, hits all of those notes, especially for those who might have reluctant readers, young readers, or people struggling with language. All of that, like this is a great intro book because anybody I think can kind of enjoy it. Moving up, we'll talk about sort of the teens and tweens books. Now for boys, that's boy comics or shonen, and for girls, that's shoujo, girl comics. And traditionally speaking, these are where you can see the most stylistic differences, right? Where you have the super flowery giant eyes, everyone's crying, emotional girl comics, so to speak, usually about relationships, romance, family dynamics, that kind of stuff, versus the boy comics, right? Giant robots and fantasy and explosions and, very ninjas, right? Classic stuff like that. It's sort of your traditional shonen book, right? Now, what's interesting, some of the most popular books are the ones that kind of dip a toe in each of these wells, where they appeal to both boys and girls, either from one perspective or another. Either it's a girl comic masquerading as a boy comic or another way around. And so like there are like, especially that's evolved within the last, I think 10-20 years. But not to say that there aren't still, very traditional girl comics and boy comics, or at least intending to be. And again, I'm trying to keep this to the sort of traditional Japanese manga. But I would say for a shoujo book, probably the most traditional one we're going to have in the LibraryPass catalog is going to be Peach Girl. It's a story of a young teenage girl named Momo, and her misadventures in high school with love and romance and, uh, gossipy friends and betrayal, and basically very, slice of life Japanese girl
I can see my
story
daughter
where
picking that
she
up
is,
right now.
struggling with
Yeah.
yeah, and struggling with, perceptions of herself. That's probably one of the most shoujo-y sort of titles
That's
we
such
have.
a popular like genre. I think that would be really great. Okay.
So that's good for anybody to get their feet wet, understanding what a sort of traditional shoujo book might be. And maybe a slightly less traditional one is what I want to point out to. It's Noragami Stray God. This book is super cool. It is it's one of those that is going to appeal to both the shoujo and the shonen reader. The character that most readers would identify is female, and she gets sort of sucked into the fantasy world of this stray god, a kami, which is in sort of the traditional Japanese religion of Shinto, sort of the idea of like everything has a spirit, sort of an animism sort of approach. And so like he is a stray god in that he doesn't have a shrine. He doesn't have worshipers. He's almost out of power. And so he's forced to do like these menial tasks to just kind of keep himself going. And he falls his paths cross with this girl who then gets sort of supernaturally entangled with him, we'll just say, and then dealing with all the politics of the afterlife, well, the realm of the gods and all this kind of stuff. It's very, very fun, and like it sort of hits both of those notes because it's very relationship based, betrayals and that kind of stuff, but also it's got a lot of fun action stuff and fantasy and gods and stuff. So that's kind of a little bit of both. Moving on, the shonen books, these we're going to have more examples of. Start with first the one that's people are just going to either know or your readers are going to want to ask for, and that's fairy tale, because there are a bunch of volumes of that all on the Comics Plus
They've been really
platform.
popular already, so
very, very popular, and with good reason. Because it's a super fun story and maybe one of our best examples of a kind of traditional shonen title. Very frenetic, very high energy, lots of like pretty girls, badass dudes kicking butt, like magic and explosions and surprises, and a talking cat that can fly and all kinds of weirdness, right? That only makes sense in a manga book, which is basically sort of this fantastical reimagining of, I think, Europe. It's kind of Europe-y, but it doesn't matter, right? It's just what you just deal, right? Strap in, it's fairy tale, man.
Yeah.
And so it's super fun and like and is definitely like will get your readers hooked. And then like let's reverse, right? So instead of like the kind of popcorny, candy fairy tale, we've got Cells at Work. And that's going to hit on a couple levels too. One, there's an anime, so they might be already familiar with this idea, but it definitely leans very heavily into your sort of like STEM ideas. It's basically this it's a story about these people who are basically anthropomorphized cells in a human body. Like one's a white blood cell, one's a red blood cell. There are, invading viruses and all kinds of stuff. It's very exciting, but it still teaches you about science, whether you knew it or not, right? So it kind of sneaks it in there.
I like it.
So that's what I think the librarian could utilize, this like edutainment, right? Or whatever, that kind of like,
oh yeah, we love it.
However it sticks, it's going to stick. And there are some very memorable characters in Cells at Work that may, cement something in a way that otherwise it wouldn't have stuck. Who can say, right? So I think that's worthwhile. So let's move on. After the teens and tweens, we got the sort of older readers, and it can go even farther than this. But for now, we're just going to focus on like older stories for older women, stories for older men. And that would be josei for women or seinen for men. Now, josei has a lot of the same beats as a shoujo book might. Sometimes they're indistinguishable from one another unless you really know what you're looking for. Chances are there are technically shoujo books that skew for older readers and josei books that would be fine for teens. Whatever, right? But the idea is like it's sort of like trying to be more mature, where in your case where you're like, oh, these th- this depiction is maybe a little too whimsical for
Mhm.
the notes I'm trying to land in this story. Maybe some of the josei style where it kind of pulls it back a little bit, slightly more, realistic, quote unquote, human depictions, etc. Still very emotive and all that stuff. It's all still there, as well as a lot of these visual storytelling styles. And occasionally it will regress into more, shoujo-y kind of stuff here and there, depending on the creator. But again, it tries to deal with slightly more mature themes. Mature sexual relations, for instance, would be far more of a josei title than one for teen girls, for instance. I think the one that would kind of characterize one of our most josei quote unquote type of books be Tokyo Tariba Girls, which is basically a story of a bunch of 20 something professional women in Japan who are kind of over dating or having trouble dating or kind of over men. And then a lot of it's kind of humorous, a lot of very shoujo-y things start happening to them, and this weird relationship begins with this like very fashionable guy, but it kind of turns a lot of the tropes on its head. It's
It sounds
definitely
very
for an
Sex in
older
the
reader.
City.
Yes, yeah, it's sort of
Yeah.
like Tokyo Sex in the City. I think would be
Interesting.
a very
Well,
apt
I'm in, so.
comp to. Exactly. Okay, great. So, and then I guess from the less known, I like this book, and I like it for a couple reasons. One, because it's a josei book, or calls itself a josei book anyway, but its principal characters aren't women; they're men. Descending Stories. Descending Stories is very much does what I think manga does the best. What I love about and why I will read almost anything, because I will learn all this stuff from it. A lot of times what they'll do is they'll take like some very traditional type of like Japanese art, Japanese poetry, Japanese performance, whatever. And then the idea is the characters in the story either find they have like a strange talent for this weird, traditional thing, or they have a weird passion for it, or whatever. And then it becomes this like deep dive into learning about its history, its traditions, adapting it, understanding the traditions, and then one way or another performing them. Oftentimes it's like, a lot of times they'll use like the club in the Japanese school, like the Kodo club. Now everybody learns this like old school, way to play the Kodo, right? And then there's the one who's the super, master at it, and all this, and you learn so much about the art form. Descending Stories does the same thing with rakugo, which is like a form of like Japanese. It's kind of like stand-up comedy. I don't really know. I didn't know much about it until I read this book, to tell you the truth. But it's like about this guy who gets out of prison, and he decides that like he was inspired by this rakugo performer who came to prison, so he wants to become one. And so he's got to go through all of it. He tracks down a master, and he learns about the art, and he works his way up to even be considered to be an apprentice, like all this kind of stuff. And in the course of doing so, you get this huge download of like Japanese history and the history of this art form and all the great creators of it. And it's another one of those like sneakily, I learned something while I was entertained. Last but not least is the final category, which again might be the most prolific you might find, is the seinen. That is the manga for men. Typically, these are the books for older readers. They tend to deal with a lot of violence or gore or sex or combinations of all of those things. Oftentimes sci-fi horror, but many other types of books can be considered seinen. And as far as my picks are concerned, I mean, I guess there's like two approaches. The first would be, let's talk about what we would consider maybe the most traditional seinen book that you can find on the LibraryPass website, which is Lone Wolf and Cub, which is a very well-known, popular title about a father and son Ronin and their violent adventures across historical Japan. That also would be another one of those that might educate you along the way, certainly about the many of the challenges that might have faced someone of the samurai class, or a Ronin, a fallen member of that class.
Okay.
Switching gears then, this might be the more fan favorite one, but that's Battle Angel, and that's probably my favorite pick. That is probably arguably the first manga I ever read. I read that in high school, so that would have been 96.
I was gonna say, so
95
it's been
even.
around a while, but I didn't want
Yeah.
to age shame.
So that you might recognize Alita Battle Angel, the James Cameron movie, which is based on the works of Yukito Kishiro, which is his Battle Angel series. But he went, that is a super deep series that we actually have the whole thing. We have the omnibuy and we have the spinoff that came out of it. Basically, he ended the series, which is kind of when I was reading it. And then he sort of a couple years later sort of redid the ending, and then where would it go from here? And so that's Battle Angel Last Order. We have all of that stuff too. And then actually we have the one, Her Adventures on Mars too, which are more flashbacks. There is a lot of material about Battle Angel, and what is great, this is another one of those examples of like, Yukito Kishiro is one of the great mangakas of Japan. He was winning awards when he was 18, and he's been making stuff ever since. Battle Angel is probably my favorite of his work, but he was clearly influenced by a lot of Western ideas that find their way into his what is essentially a cyberpunk dystopian future.
Nice.
Right, where it's got elements of sort of your traditional Japanese manga, but is influenced by all kinds of other ideas, particularly philosophical ones. It is a very deep, dark psychological thriller, and that asks all kinds of questions of what it means to be human, what it means to be in love, especially when you are mostly a machine, right? And asking questions like that, it's fascinating. I love it. I will reread that book kind of almost whenever I feel like it, because it's every time it's beautiful too. So that's my last pick of that will also teach you something along the way, maybe, but is also strap in because it is dark and not for everyone. So I think those are probably our best picks for sort of the traditional types of manga, and what you can read on the Comics Plus platform of each of them.
And you mentioned Tezuka at the top of our discussion.
Oh,
here.
I did. And actually,
Tezuka,
he would be my, yes, right. He would be my second Kotomomuki pick. Although, to be fair, Tezuka had a long career and he made books that would qualify for every one of the things we just talked about.
That's cool. We have like a curated Tezuka list if people are interested in checking it out.
We do. And I would actually put Unico, which is his story of a unicorn, a cute unicorn, the adventures of a cute unicorn, a very Disney-esque kind of adventure.
Okay.
And we put that in Kotomomuke because that's appropriate for all ages, right? So now you got the two picks, and then you can talk about Tezuka and as a librarian and trace his career from Astro Boy, which is the one I think most people would know him for, to his like less known stuff, all the way up to his very, very adult books. Then we have quite a few of them on the LibraryPass platform too.
Okay, so no, this is great. And so thank you for this. Like, it's definitely made me interested in wanting to read some more of these and kind of check out more. Got some webinars, some outside resources, and that includes defending the collection from censorship and a few other of the modern challenges that are coming up for manga. And then we will also include a video on how to physically read a manga, because it is different than reading a traditional Western left to right print or digital book. So we've got you guys covered. Rob's picks will also be included in a written form. So if you didn't catch those zooming by today, you will be able to read those as well. And of course, access them to the Comics Plus platform. So thank you so much, Rob, for coming and illuminating all of this for us. I know I learned a lot.
Great. Well, my pleasure. I hope everybody got at least something out of it that they're now curious to explore. And there is a lot where that came from. We have just dipped our toe into how deep this goes, and the demand for manga on the Japanese level like way outstrips what European or American comics ever were. So there is always new stuff coming out all the time. And whatever we can get, we will definitely have on our platform too. So like, stay tuned because there's way more to learn and for this to grow on your platform as well.
So our full package of resources will be available at support.librarypass.com. And as always, you can reach out to Rob or myself or any of the LibraryPass team by emailing support@librarypass.com. So thanks again and enjoy the recommendations.